In the late 19th century, workers had barely any rights. They toiled for long hours under dreadful conditions, with little to no security. But as the Industrial Revolution gained momentum, so too did the labor movement. Workers began to organize and demand better conditions and fair pay. This was the birth of labor rights activism. Labor activism gained traction in the early 20th century. The formation of the International Workers of the World in 1905 was a significant milestone. This organization was instrumental in advocating for an 8-hour workday, a concept we take for granted today. The Great Depression of the 1930s further highlighted the need for workers' rights. The creation of the National Labor Relations Board in 1935 was a direct response to this crisis. It provided workers with the right to form unions and bargain collectively. Fast forward to the current era and it seems we've hit a stumbling block. Despite the advancements of the past, we're witnessing a silent crisis in workers' rights. There's a lack of vocal and active leadership. Figures like Kshama Sawant and Dr. Stein, who once championed the cause, have stepped back from the limelight. Without strong advocacy, the progress of the past is at risk. Workers are facing increasing challenges, from the rise of the gig economy to the erosion of union power. The need for minimum federal standards and a National Workers' Compensation Commission has never been more pressing. In summary, the journey of labor rights activism has been a roller coaster ride. From the humble beginnings in the late 19th century to the victories of the 20th century, and now to the silent crisis of the 21st century. The lack of advocacy from figures like Kshama Sawant and Dr. Stein, coupled with the absence of minimum federal standards and a National Workers' Compensation Commission, has left workers in a precarious position. The lessons of history are clear. Vocal and active leadership is crucial in the fight for workers' rights. It's time for a new wave of labor rights activism. The fight for fair treatment, security, and decent pay for all workers must continue. The silent crisis in workers' rights needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed now. In the midst of this silent crisis, some key figures have remained notably silent. One such figure is the president of the United Auto Workers Union, whose voice could have been a beacon for workers' rights, but has instead been noticeably absent from the conversation. Similarly, U.S. Representative Pramila Jayapal, a known advocate for labor rights, has been unexpectedly quiet. Their silence speaks volumes about the current state of workers' rights and the need for a new wave of activism to fill this void. Voiceover. In the fight for labor rights, there are echoes of a voice that once rang loud and clear. Eugene Debs, a prominent labor leader and socialist, was an unwavering advocate for workers' rights during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His voice, once a clarion call for the working class, would today be drowned out in the clamor of business interests and political maneuvering. Debs, a 5-time candidate for the presidency of the United States, was a tireless advocate for workers, pushing for better working conditions and wages, and against the exploitation of the working class. His life's work was dedicated to championing labor rights, a legacy that seems to have been forgotten by the very people who should be its greatest proponents. Today we see the liberal left often hark back to Debs and his ideals, using his history as a rallying point. Yet, when it comes to the current crisis in workers' rights, their voices are suspiciously silent. The deafening silence on this issue contrasts sharply with the noise they make in other areas, revealing a lack of focus on workers' basic federal human rights over business interests. This silence, however, should not be seen as a reason to abandon hope. Instead, it should be seen as a call to action. Debs' legacy is a reminder of the power of a single voice, and a call to action for today's left to not only remember history but to actively fight for workers' rights today. For as Debs himself once said, "Years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Voiceover. In the midst of this silent crisis, one would expect the roar of protest from the champions of labor rights, the labor news outlets, yet the silence is deafening. Mother Jones, a magazine named after a prominent labor and community organizer, once a beacon of labor rights advocacy, has remained notably silent. A similar silence echoes from the pages of other labor reporters like In These Times and Journalist for Labor. These outlets, known for their staunch defense of workers' rights, have been conspicuously quiet about the federal human rights issue plaguing our workforce. This begs the question, why? Why have these media outlets, who have traditionally been the voice of the worker, fallen silent on such a critical issue? Their silence raises more questions than answers about the current state of workers' rights. It underscores the urgent need for a new wave of activism, an activism that fills this void, that amplifies the forgotten voice of Eugene Debs, and that fights relentlessly for the rights of every worker. The silence of these labor news outlets is not just a lack of noise, it's a call to action for all of us. A reminder that we must be the voice for those whose cries for justice are being ignored. Voiceover. In the midst of this silent crisis, one would expect the roar of protest from America's faith leaders, yet their silence is deafening. Reverend Barber, heralded by the liberal left as today's Martin Luther King Jr., is the face of the Poor People's Campaign. As he addresses Congress on Medicare for All, his silence on the federal labor rights issue is conspicuous. Let us not forget, Martin Luther King Jr. was not silent. He was assassinated in Memphis, where he had gone to support striking garbage truck drivers. Today, a waste collector dies on the job every day in America. Yet the silence from Reverend Barber and other faith leaders is palpable. Why is this? Why have these faith leaders, who have traditionally been the voice of the marginalized and the oppressed, chosen silence over outcry? Their silence raises more questions than answers about the current state of workers' rights. It underscores the urgent need for a new wave of activism. An activism that fills this void, that amplifies the forgotten voice of Eugene Debs, and that fights relentlessly for the rights of every worker. The silence of these faith leaders is not just a lack of noise, it's a call to action for all of us. A reminder that we must be the voice for those whose cries for justice are being ignored. It's time for us to break the silence and let our voices be heard. Voiceover. In the midst of this silent crisis, one would expect the roar of protest from our political leaders. Yet their silence is deafening. Senator Bernie Sanders, a self-proclaimed champion for the working class, wrote a letter in 2015 voicing his concerns about the state of workers' rights. Yet for 8 long years, his silence on this issue has been striking. The silence doesn't stop there. Washington State Governor Jay Inslee, President Biden, President Trump, and Dr. Jill Stein, all who have had continuous runs for presidency, have remained noticeably quiet. Their campaigns filled with promises for the working class, yet their silence on the labor rights issue is conspicuous. One begins to wonder, was the initial letter just an attempt to pacify the workers? Their silence raises more questions than answers about their commitment to workers' rights. It underscores the urgent need for a new wave of activism, an activism that fills this void, that amplifies the forgotten voice of Eugene Debs, and that fights relentlessly for the rights of every worker. The silence of these political leaders is not just a lack of noise, it's a call to action for all of us, a reminder that we must be the voice for those whose cries for justice are being ignored. It's time for us to break the silence and let our voices be heard.